what mass media very often do is that they do something for us which we usually do as humans, and that is to bring the world under concepts. We have concepts and we have experience of world, and somehow the experience has to be matched with the concepts we have, and that comes described as one of the principles in the critique of judgment. And I think exactly this relation between the conceptual framework which we have and the experience in the world, and bringing those two together, seemed to me something which kind of resonated in all of your three talks. I was wondering if that would be something to start with.
Yes, it would. I think it would too. I agree with that. Jesper, do you agree?
Yes.
I mean, I feel like that's a. You should have told us what your questions were going to be, so we could have studied more.
Adorno is awesome. Simon Ferrari and I were having a conversation about this last night. I love to go look at famous philosophers and see whether they secretly loved games or liked cowboy novels or something like that. So Adorno hated games, I think. He was pretty consistently, he never slipped and let it be known that he spent all night, every night playing Minesweeper or something like that. Solitaire. But it turns out Benjamin loved games. Mm-hmm. So maybe you can throw him in there. He designed puzzles and was very fond of card games and stuff like that. I think this notion of bringing conceptual frameworks closer to the world is a good one. I mean, when we talk about elevating games, or whether games can shoulder the burden of art, the responsibility of being profound. Really, a lot of times, this whole issue of whether games are meaningful or not has a lot to do, I think, with this idea of concept, right? Of whether and how they resonate with the rest of the world, right? So if what you do is, when you play Go, is just, or what you do when you play Tetris, is just pour all of your attention to a black hole that absorbs it and it's gone forever, then that's maybe not good. But if what you do is then has connections to the rest of the world in important and meaningful ways, then that counts, right?
But yeah, in terms of applying a conceptual framework to the world, I do think, I guess going back to Kant, right? So discussions of aesthetics are often sort of user manuals, right? So like how to behave in a gallery and stuff like that. And so what we're doing here, and I guess so what Frank was doing here was also to, I guess you provided a kind of somewhat open user manual for like where to locate what's interesting in games, but also again certainly to sort of make a case for their sort of autonomy, or at least like that you cannot just directly sort of try to assume that they fit perfectly into existing conceptual frameworks. But I do think that doing this is, I mean, it's a kind of it's a work and it's a process that we do to sort of ourselves think about what it is what it means to actually look at a game and to sort of take it seriously and to consider it meaningful, and then also that we're trying to sort of expand that to a sort of broader public and perhaps to game designers, and game designers are trying to convince us, and some of us are game designers and so on. But I just think that the conceptual, wow, I'm talking about conceptual work. I really hate talking about it. I hate that kind of way of thinking. But I think, okay, we're doing good work, it's great.
The only thing I have to add is that listening to you talk, I was thinking, a lot of this is about creating a scaffolding in which we can generate understanding, right? Creating the rule set, if you will, for how we creating the language. And is part of the problem that each game individually has its own little hermetic system that you first have to know, and then figure out a way to scaffold around that with a larger conceptual framework. I wonder if that's part of the problem of the amount of time it takes to, it took Duchamp a lifetime to get to where he was with chess, right? So that's just one game. And, he has a lot of thinking about games, but he didn't tend to, he knew that's what he knew, and he seems to have not strayed far from that path, right? In his talking about games, he focused very much on chess. He wasn't presuming to say that all applied to
Yeah,
every other game.
He was also really interested in roulette, and he had that whole
Right,
scheme
yeah.
where he was going to go break the bank and sold shares in himself.
Yeah.
And I've tried very hard. I don't know if anyone knows what his scheme was. I worry that it was just the martingale. I think maybe it was just this this betting scheme that actually doesn't work, but that people sometimes think does. I hope he was smarter than that, but I don't think he was. I don't think he was.
I don't know.
I mean, but I'm always, a big question for me is really where does this pleasure comes from? You know, I mean, games is always about, you know, a huge part is really pleasure. Right? It needs to be joyful in a way. It has something to do. You talked about processes and maybe also anticipation, that we anticipate something to happen and then it either happens or it doesn't happen, and depending on how that kicks in, we have different kinds of rewards or anticipation.
This one we can chew on.
Yeah, no, I'm a little uncertain about this thing with pleasure, right? So I think there's a certain consensus that fun is too broad a word, but I was been interested in the question of failure, where it seems, generally speaking, people prefer games in which they fail over games in which they don't fail. And that has this kind of paradox. So why do you like it? Because you don't like it. Because you don't like to fail, but then you like the game more, etc. So it just seems it's a sort of a wrong word. Like pleasure can be a wrong word. You don't just do things for pleasure. You might do things for other reasons. So for example, my playing of StarCraft, I'm not a good StarCraft player, but I was sort of obsessed by it, and I was miserable for like several years. I was like, seriously, if you'd taken these like gamer photos, I would be like, just like, it's really, it was a pain, but I kept doing it, right? So it doesn't, I don't think it describes, pleasure doesn't describe games
The last
very
level
well.
of Portal.
Yeah, so I think sometimes you have that, sometimes you smile, perhaps if you win, but sometimes you don't win. I think it's a sort of very small part of the kind of emotions you go through when you play a game.
But I thought Ralph Koster's book came up last night, right? And that, A Theory of Fun, which is, I think, presumes pleasure and enjoyment. But then there's much more that can be explored. I think that's one of the things the art games movement is, where it's one of the areas that's sort of probing right now with Jason's game Gravitation, which is a really wonderful game. I have never had fun while playing that game. I'm sorry, Jason. Yeah, that is not fun, but it's still very much a game, and it's still, it's the kind of experience I want there to be more of it. I think that fun is one flavor, right? And games can be more than one flavor. I think it's one way to look at it. There's more space to explore there.
But also, I mean, you're never having like fun every single moment when you're playing a game. That just never happens, right?
No.
So I mean, I can go to a restaurant and I can actually enjoy every single bite, but I can never play a game and enjoy every single moment.
This is true.
It's not really part of games.
It's really true that many games are as much about suffering as they are about joy.
It's a huge
They really are,
Yeah.
and on purpose. And
it's like bang your head against a wall over and over and over, and then
It's
there's
like-
a euphoria of getting through
Yeah, it's
it,
like
past it.
like, yeah, if you look at like runners, when you are competing as in a long distance run, I mean, they're having so much fun. They're enjoying themselves. They're torturing themselves, and the pleasure is almost the carrot or the pleasure, right, is not the thing that the game is designed to produce as often as it's there to get you into this thing, this harness, which provides all kinds of weird, complicated things.
Maybe just emotional intensity or something, right?
Right, the
gratification.
plenitude is a small part of the restaurant experience,
Yes.
which includes the anxiety of the coming pleasure.
Yeah, but it's not just intensification of experience, because sometimes it's oblivion, right, which you can't really describe as super intense. It's like, what? Where am I?
I mean, you talk, John, and you talk, you refer to contemporary art and how often this art world is so detached, where we are standing so far away from it, and we reflect on it, and we have this amazing intellectual thought, which might work on art. And I think, Jesper, you have that in a similar way. I'm still curious about this, the difference of this experience in the artwork, which is this kind of pure contemplation to this game experience, and how can we?
They don't work. Yeah, I mean, I feel like, well, one, I mean, the gallery experience, the museum experience as we know it today is something, you know, I'm generalizing, like you probably noticed, everything I've said for the last 2 days is a gross generalization, but museums were invented in the 19th century, and our conception of what you do when you walk into a gallery space, when you walk into the White Cube, is one based, you know, well over 100 years ago on a particular moment of what art was at that time. And we haven't necessarily transformed what that space is and how we sort of culturally interpret what we're supposed to do once we walk into those rooms to be. We still think we're just supposed to stand there and observe.
I was going to say that I think this is a problem that's larger than really just a relationship between games and a certain mode of presenting culture like that comes from art. Because I think the problem of how you learn about a game, how it's first presented to you, how you first understand what it is, what its qualities are like, how you come to first play it, why you are interested in playing it in the first place, and then the process by which you start to understand it and learn it more, and then acquire a certain level of mastery, and then become integrated into it as culture. Like, this is a process that's really hard and challenging, and we don't do a good job of it in video games. I'm convinced, it's hard for me to believe that Modern Warfare 2 is less deep and complex than chess. It obviously is more, just technically, mathematically more. But if you walk into a chess club, I think there's probably more rituals for bringing you in to become a chess player, to like easing you into the culture of chess. If you then being plunked down into the middle of Modern Warfare 2, which is a horrifying experience. Or Halo, competitive Halo, or whatever. People talk about it all the time. These competitive games are just nasty. They're horrible, nasty experiences. Just like 14-year-olds cursing and swearing at me. And I often think of jazz music. If you go watch a jazz band, the younger players and the older players, the relationship of like cultivating these younger players into the culture and bringing them up, because they know that they've got to keep jazz alive, and that's part of what you have to do. I think if we could do a better job of that in the marketplace and in marketing games, and it's not just an issue of art and culture, but just the survival of these things.
It's just a general problem of the product-driven, commerce-driven, consumption-driven way we consume all experiences at this point, right? It applies to art and games.
Consumption or not, I mean, even if it's a free museum, you have that problem.
Yeah,
but if it's a paid product, you have that problem. It's just a real hard problem.
Yeah.
But I thought it was interesting to consider sort of gallery design as game design.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, as you were pointing out, that there's something very nice about galleries, in that they're sort of designed to not punish the player for failing,
mm-hmm.
and even the player is allowed to sort of to put on with like poker face and not demonstrate failure. No. So I mean, that's pretty important. That makes it less intimidating than it would have been otherwise. In games, pretty tough.
Is it possible that that's one of the things that's contributed to the moribund state of art, though? I mean, is it possible that that's not such a good thing? But the fact that you can drift through a gallery and give every impression of being, hip to what's cool in modern art, and have no idea what you're looking at or talking about, is maybe a problem.
I guess it's a double-edged sword, right?
Yeah.
But the length of games is still a problem, right? So of course some people make short-form games, but then even like a 10-minute game might be a little long for some people to get into. So I don't know. Perhaps you should have it closed-up booths where people don't.
It's called houses.
Yes.
Oh, no, but it's like people playing in privacy. I'm just saying that I think a lot of when people don't play video games often have very low opinions of their own skills, and they're afraid of actually playing a video game because they don't want to be embarrassed, and that does provide a kind of barrier to entry.
Yeah, well, that Jason with the Passage, when it was Gamma, whatever, 3 years ago, I guess, I remember him talking about the fact that people couldn't stay with the game for the 5 minutes it took to play it, that they were just wandering off and not having the full experience. So 5 minutes is too much for some people.
Oh, actually, it's, yeah, I wonder if there are some ways that could be signaled more clearly, actually, yeah. So anyway, some discussion, so like...
You have 3 more minutes to play.
Oh,
It's
no,
never
but
going to
seriously, I
work.
mean, but
It's not going to work.
but-
No version of this ever works, I think. Because imagine, like, I mean, for certain games it will work. There's plenty of games that you actually can have a 5-minute experience. Passages is a good example of one that's kind of designed to provide a very fulfilling and complete experience.
Mhm.
And if it doesn't work there, like that's totally one end of the spectrum. There's nothing more. You can't go farther in that direction. And most games, it's absurd to imagine that just drifting up to it and for 5, 10, or even 15 minutes, you're really going to like get what that game has to offer.
Well, that raises the question of you know, criticism and analysis of games. A lot of the reviews, a lot of the people writing about games do just sort of dip their toe in the water and play one level or play the demo, or and then go watch a little bit of YouTube footage or something, and then use that as the basis for analysis. Would a film critic try to pull that same move?
Oh, okay, but here's an interesting question. I guess one of the problems with games is that you don't have a guarantee that you're seeing everything, right?
You're not.
Most of the time.
If it's a game, you're not.
I mean, it's more like a travel, right? I mean, it's something which you start and then you do it for a while, and you have some kind of goal of something. So at some point you stop, right? And then this end point is something which is defined by the game in most cases. You brought in Robert Rauschenberg's Open Score, and I think that's a beautiful piece which shows. I mean, the lights go out, they play in the dark, and then even I think after the lights are going out, then they have music and they projection and they film the audience, and so it's this journey into a completely dissolved open space, right? Which I think is a wonderful metaphor for game travel.
Yeah, I think that piece in the whole series that is part of were pretty magical, but they were complicated just from a very practical point of view. The audience and the players, I imagine it felt more like a party than it felt like anything really formal. Just the experience, everybody kind of there together,
Who was the force at Bell Labs that made that happen?
Billy Kluver.
And did he go on to do other stuff? Did he
Experiments and
get pulled into the art world more, or did he stay? Was he originally an engineer?
He was an engineer
Uh-huh.
to begin with,
Yeah.
but then he founded this group.
Yeah. They have the 9 evenings. In
Yeah, the 9
right?
evenings.
John
So yeah,
Cage or
they're,
something, and-
he's Kluver is a really pretty fascinating, great guy, and has a very funny voice, if you ever hear him talk.
Can I go back to the question of criticism
Yeah,
for
please.
a second? So I said, like, we talk about like exhibiting games and so on. One of the problems, of course, is people don't really know what to do with them. And so I have an example of a game, say Half-Life 2 Episode 1. So Valve actually has stats that say like less than 50% of the people who play the game completed. And that gives an interesting question as a critic, right? So on one hand, there's a kind of intuition that to be a critic, you should sort of play the game through and know everything about it. On the other hand, if you do that, your experience is not going to be representative.
No.
And so that's the kind of conundrum that's hard to solve.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the notion of travel as a metaphor for criticism. And maybe video game criticism could become a little bit more like travel writing, where you never presume that you're not telling people that that Mallorca is better than Thailand, right?
Yeah.
Because you're not trying to compare these two things and saying, oh, this one's better and this one's better.
Yeah.
You're saying, well, what kind of thing do you want? And here's what I love, Otherwise, it's ridiculous. You're like, oh, let me describe my trip to France. I had a bag thrown on my head, and I was kidnapped, and I was put in a trunk, and it was black and dark, and I was not allowed to eat. I hate France. You know what I mean? Like, that's not right. I mean, that's a lot of critics talking about video games, basically like talking about it.
Yeah.
But it also strikes me that...
No, the person to your right. I'm kidding. No.
It strikes me that this idea of travel writing as criticism, which is an interesting idea, is where, Frank, your idea of the sort of game player as a manifestation of a kind of rational, obsessive, bumps up against what's positive about games, right? Is that Metacritic in a certain sense is sort of functional rationalism run riot over the subtleties of comparing two like or unlike objects.
Yeah.
In fact,
That's
so
the
that, but it's exactly the tension is that it's exactly that same kind of functional rationalism which
Right.
you're arguing makes games interesting and unique. So I think that there's,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what the metaphor is, but there's like a
Maybe a
devil in the
snake
background
eating
of
itself.
Satan, yeah.
No, but isn't it just because games as artifacts and games as experiences are sort of seem to be in different realms, basically. Yeah. So the games are on some level they are logical structures, but that's not necessarily how you experience them.
But that's an interesting distinction between, we have the notion that artworks are more objects, right, and that they are not giving experience, that this kind of the assumption, which I'm not sure is true.
No, it's not.
No,
Yeah,
it's
no,
not
I agree.
true.
So yeah, when I want to like develop a more, you know, complex or aesthetics, I want them to, because you can then look back and see these other things were never tidy packages, like, you know, because, but they feel more like that. But I think that we can go back and these other things aren't like that at all. These other things are also like processes, you know.
I'll go quickly back just for a second. The travel log idea.
Yeah.
It made me immediately think of Pilgrim and the Microworld.
Yeah.
Which is, for those of you who haven't read it, you should. But it's a one man's journey through Breakout, the video game, and it is one of the best things ever written about games by far, I think.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Just wanted to throw that out there.
I'm interested in this notion of process really, because I think, you know, if we try to think about think about games as being an art form, and if we try to, you all talked about the possible distinction between and bridging. You know, first identify a difference, and then how can we then bring it back together and make games to be appreciated by the art, system, maybe not market, or the art system. And this notion of process is something that is a little my interest in the art historical field. That I think that a lot of artwork, especially in the 20th century, are very similar focus on processes. If you think about participation art, you brought up fluxes, you brought up a lot of performance art, installation art is also something which needs to be in a public place, it needs to be experienced, needs to be walked through, and so forth. So this breakup of art in the 20th century as being something which is not an object anymore, which goes in a frame, hung up, insured for millions, and protected by white walls and police guards and so forth, but rather something which is the creation of a certain type of experience. I think that's it's a tragedy which we can witness in the second part of the 20th century, and the not exclusively, but it becomes more. And at the same time, the game industry or the game designers are working in a very similar way. But what exactly is so similar about it, and how is it different? I mean, the cultural critique would be a lot of games work with stereotypes, or things of which are easy to anticipate. And if it's, I'm talking the schematic production of blockbuster, right? But not. So in what way can art games be similar, process related, but then open and interesting? What are new strategies in art game development? Maybe that would be one question.
That's a good question. Everybody's
So
looking at
I guess if we talk about the sort of, so games are also artifacts and they are processes, right? So, but it seems the way you're talking about it, it seems that the obvious sort of parallel would be something like Second Life experiments, where people collaboratively make things in that world. So that seems to be like the obvious solution. And then the other one is just that in a way it's always sort of been going on. Like folk games are these kind of weird collectively designed, undeterminate processes that just like take time and aren't really owned by anything, and are sort of like designed by the collective wisdom or whatever of sort of entire cultures over millennia. And that's like, I think is another sort of interesting sort of parallel.
So that it opens up to like involving everybody, or
and then in a way what happens with video games is that it's going to get shut down, right? That even if you buy a commercial board game, it's sort of fairly easy to tinker with the rules, and then especially early on, video games have been sort of very locked down and sort of have come as sort of fixed packages to which the player doesn't have any access. And since something like with modding and stuff, it's then it's sort of opening up again.
That's such a wonderful. There's a great example of that open design process, and a kind of an example of the slipperiness of these things as coherent works, which I think is the development of Defense of the Ancients, which is Defense of the Ancients. Dota is a game that it's an enormously successful and popular game among a certain sort of generation of like young men mostly. And a lot of people, it sort of occupies the space that Counter-Strike used to occupy, which was this stealth mega hit that was not originally even a piece of commercial culture. It was a mod of an existing game in Half-Life. And Dota is that for Blizzard, for StarCraft and Warcraft. It's a game that just emerged over time. It's now it's such an enormously successful and influential game as a mod of Warcraft 3. That it has spawned a lot of commercial games that are basically just deeply inspired by it. But it itself, it's very hard to trace it back to a single author. It's sort of, one of its authors is Blizzard and the underlying engine of StarCraft, where it has its first roots, and then Warcraft 3. But then there's this whole, and like currently you can point to Ice Frog, who's the guy that runs it and manages it now, and clearly one of the authors, and he's but then along the way it just like evolves and emerges. So we it's easy to think that, oh, that used to happen, chess, Go, you can't point to an author, but nowadays we make these things and put them out. And yet there's this like super important, influential, almost a whole new genre of game, and it has that same kind of like weird, intense, emergent thing. It just happened in the community of the people who play Blizzard games in this very compressed way over the course of like 5 or 6 years.
But that also requires a kind of corporate decision to allow
openness
to do that sort of thing, and which people weren't necessarily willing to do in the past.
So I think, and then that maybe could be a strategy for art games, right? I mean, to say, let's look at that. How did Blizzard and the people who played StarCraft and Warcraft collaborate in this way, and can we engineer that kind of collaboration and produce works that are interesting to us in that way?
So listening to you talk made me think of Space War, and it had a very similar kind of evolution. A game made in 1962 by some college students at MIT that just got modded and modded and modded and modded over and over again, and people were still playing it and running tournaments in the 70s of this game long after there was many other games to play. There was something that resonated for a certain community. They kept changing it, making regional variants, or a particular school would have their own version that they created of the game.
So what I would love to have is for that kind of openness and that collaborative emergent design process, and yet still keep the game designer as a well-paid and highly respected. I have a vested interest in that, so we can keep both of those things. I would really be happy.
Yeah, and the game designer would be invited to give artist talks.
Yeah. But Space War kind of resisted commercialization also, right? When Bushnell makes Computer Space, it was a bomb.
Yeah.
So in one context it failed miserably, in another context it was on fire.
Yesterday in the keynote we heard about learning from the masters, and then I was wondering, can we project it maybe even further back, not to the 80s, maybe not just to the Renaissance, maybe back to the Romans. I mean, bread and games, right? I mean, the Colosseum. This is like a tremendously successful, immersive, spectacle, which involves an empire, basically, right? I mean, if you play baseball or something, then we have this immersion is achieved, right? I mean, you have this kind of what we desperately are looking for, getting out of the monitor screen into reality, talking about hybrid game realities, extending into real world, this strategy. We all had it at the beginning, right? And in what way can we learn from this beginning?
It's like one of the things that, that I had more time, the fresco cycle I showed from Ferrara, right? There's so many strong connections to clearly somebody was thinking about Roman athletics And there's most of those frescoes, the athletes are nude, and in these poses that are very reminiscent to the poses you might see in Greek and Roman sculpture. And the back end, right? Like the most famous of the piece of sculpture that's always trotted out when we're talking about the Olympic Games is Discobolus, right? And supposedly, I've never tried to prove this, but the pose that Discobolus is in, if he tried to throw the disc from that pose, the disc would just come slamming down and he'd probably hurt himself. Right? So the way that's been manifested in the visual arts is all about the form and the beauty of the movement, but it's not at all about the game. It's not exactly speaking to your point,
But actually, I think you go even further back, I suppose. So I mean, there's this certain argument that's been made for games like traditional analog games as being sort of remnants of say like rituals that just like lost their like ritualistic or religious meaning. So the argument has been made that say like a game like backgammon derives from Senate, that from a period of time actually had a specific religious meaning in Egypt. So games do have this connection, sort of historical connection to rituals and to religion, and perhaps now we don't see it that much anymore. I guess I don't know. Perhaps American Idol is a kind of exception, but it does sort of fulfill that kind of sort of shared.
I mean, when you grow up, then as kids we play games, and it's important to learn social behavioral roles and management and leadership, and so it always had been a massive integral part of our culture, society, upbringing, the development of personalities and so forth. And now that we are living in a time in the 21st century where games are exploding, we are starting to think why they are important.
it's kind of weird.
Yeah.
No.
It's cool. It's good. I think it's a good time.
But I mean, games always have this sort of, I forget what word Frank used just before, but games always has kind of uncertain quality to them. Are they just harmless things, or do they do something good? Do they do something bad? What does it actually mean? And that uncertainty just has been present throughout the history of games. Right?
Yeah.
So one of the examples I used was, I think it's like 1478 or something. Actually, for a period of time, golf was banned in Scotland because it was felt that the young men should be practicing archery instead. Right?
Of course,
So and then sometimes chess is considered depraved, and sometimes it's considered something that trains your mind.
And nowadays, you often hear people say, well, Guitar Hero, one of the things that's good about that is a lot of kids are learning how to play the guitar for real. Like, oh, great, teenagers are learning how to play the guitar. That's awesome. And like, in 50 years, the stupid grown-ups will be saying, oh, well, it's, they're doing this weird thing now. But some of them are learning how to play video games from doing that weird thing. So that's good. But I think, maybe in the process of like pushing games forward or elevating them or whatever it is we're doing as kind of progressives, which I feel like we all, share this common goal of helping to evolve and grow this thing. There's also, I think maybe games will always have this unsettled and slightly outsider status, and I think that's okay. I think maybe it's actually great,
Yeah. We should probably see if these folks have some questions for us.
Hi. I was wondering, where is the whole part of the interactive new media art in your discussion?
It's hidden. It's like I have a collection of CD-ROMs somewhere.
No, okay. So I get to say what I think. So I think I was alluding to before. My feeling was that in the 1990s, if we want to generalize, there was a lot of people who wanted to use something called interactivity, and they sort of associated it with games, but they didn't want it to be games. And then too much energy was spent on making something that was sort of like a game, but certainly not a game, and that just hurt the quality of what was produced.
I mean, interactive media is basically
the kind of thing you were talking about? Or were you
Well, no,
Yeah, what do you,
media?
maybe you can help
sorry.
us understand
Yeah,
a little
I'll
better,
try to-
particularly.
So
Yeah.
I'll just give you my reflex.
I'll try to exemplify it. Let's say the work of John Whitney, the work of Lillian Schwartz, Ken Moulton, general synthesis, multi-dimensional installations that's done, for instance, let's say at Ars Electronica, all these kind of things.
Right.
Where I think there's more discussion if you talk between games and art,
Yeah.
because art is not only white cube and a painting and a sculpture.
Yeah, no, I
It's a
agree.
space of experience. Yeah. I mean, when you say Ars Electronica, I think of the Nightly engine, for instance, which is a remodeling of Unreal Tournament, and it allows for participatory interaction and real-time machinima movie rendering and all this anti-war email, social components and so forth, which is really, in a way, like a new form of yeah, sure, but I think that the idea of new media is not necessarily new. You know,
No, of course, because
It's a tricky question. I mean, I love this question. I think it's a really good question because what you're really asking is about works that use interactivity, that are focused on the interactivity and using the interactivity in a way that is expressive and important and part of the aesthetics.
or coding. I mean, let's
I'm
say-
sorry, what?
Or coding. If you take the work of Casey.
Okay, so
Reese,
computation, let's say, like
Yeah.
you know, works that use computation and interactivity,
because
but are not games. And I think
I
that,
think, for instance, the work of Jody, it's more, let's say,
Right,
software
so-
art than is, let's say, game art.
okay,
Yeah.
so I think part of the thing that makes that a tricky question is that games are like a super strong attractor. So as soon as you start focusing on the interactive system and the qualities of that system, the user's choice and actions, and how those choices and actions affect the behavior of the system, you're already, it's like, so you're so close, you get sucked into a game so quickly. Like as soon as you really start paying attention to that, and if you don't pay attention to that, then you really are, like, then you're doing something where you're just like putting some stuff together and it happens to be interactive, but it's not. So I think that's the problem. I think that's a really serious, interesting
Well,
question.
I think there's a different problem, is that because I've really found a pity that you didn't start with the 9 evenings, because I think it's such an important event,
The
the 9 evening series, because I think that there lies really the beginning of contemporary
I mean, it's really
new
beautiful.
culture.
We look at those and they're really super
Yeah,
cool and
because-
interesting, but they didn't have a huge.
It had a huge impact.
But
on
they're
the
hard
way
to
we
get,
are-
I think they're hard to get at today, right?
Well, because there are not enough pictures.
Well, that's like that they,
archive now.
the way we get at them is through the archiving. It's the same thing with like Chris Burden's work, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, but Chris Burden has a much more secure place in
I'm
contemporary
just-
culture than
yes.
the work of Billy Kluver and these other.
Definitely, it's a
these
case.
other works. So it's, I think it's interesting.
It's just,
So, but I guess like something like Ars Electronica has its own battle in the sense that about
of
like
course, yeah.
about making
Because
taking,
they're also not-
taking
Yeah.
technology and taking different kind of materials, if you will, and exhibiting them as artworks, if you will, right? So, but just to Frank's thing, that's an interesting thing. So say you have the interaction, you have the system you wanna deal with, and then you wanna make sure that it's not a game. Then the problem is that if you have some kind of world or some kind of structure in which the user can interact with, then the moment there is something that sort of obviously looks more attractive than something else, that it's very easy for a user to read that as a goal. And then the way to avoid that is that you make something where the user doesn't really care
Right.
about whether it's something else, and then it becomes really boring.
And the reason for that is that goals highlight the behavior of the system. They highlight the relationship between your choices and actions and the way that affects the unfolding of the system. And so they're a way of like dropping dye into the currents that are otherwise kind of invisible. And so that's one of the reasons I think that it becomes a strong attractor. Certainly there are tons of ways to make work that are not games that have interactivity in them. And I think people should just keep doing them and I'll keep interacting with them, you know. And eventually maybe that will become its own thing. That these are non-games. I mean, the Telltale's people are here and that's something that they're very interested in, doing lots of great work in that direction. So I just think it should.
I mean, I
It's
feel
sort of
like,
like parallel tracks, right?
yeah, I mean, I feel like it was, in part, it was a very conscious decision on the part of Ian and Michael and I in our early conversations a long time ago about how to sort of focus the conversation and the discourse of this symposium. we made some decisions.
Because that's what I encounter many times with, because when people start talking about, let's say, contemporary culture or contemporary visual culture, in regards to, let's say, art, it's always this kind of art. It's always plastic art.
So give us again the one person of that list that we should all be more familiar with.
Nanzu Bai, for instance.
Yeah.
But someone else who's less famous, because in that list, like someone doing work now.
Lillian Schwartz.
Lillian Schwartz. Okay, so there you go. Shout out to Lillian
Larry
Schwartz.
Cuba.
We should all know her work better. So good.
Well, yeah, for instance, also work. No, but what my point is really, I think
We should do more questions.
the late sort of 20th century art, electronic arts, I think should be more incorporated into the discussion of contemporary culture and arts in general.
I can't argue with you.
I think you ought to agree.
Yeah.
I mean, I sort of feel bad because it kind of has to do a little bit with that. But I wanted to start by asking, is art/reality sort of getting more proceduralized, or is art/reality sort of becoming more gamic, right? And I feel like with the advent of like sort of postmodernism, post-semiotics, we've had this sort of idea that the signifier can float, and that we can have an audience that approaches it and interacts with that in any given medium and approach it with their own meanings, and that a medium can actually be writerly, producerly, and games are sort of the epitome of that. But we sort of see that spreading now to film, to literature, to even to our own real lives, to the way that we are self-aware of our own rituals and how those, in a sense, have become gamic. So maybe perhaps MMOs and tycoon games and all of these simulators don't proceduralize real life, but more life that they point out the way that our own lives are proceduralized.
Yes, so I think that's a good question. I have a strong opinion about this, which is that I think interactivity is our Steam, right? We talk about interactivity like it's a thing, but it's a conceptual framework that we have now that we're using and we're applying to the world, and it's super powerful and it's super strong, right? And it's great, and it's a great way of looking at the world. It's my way of looking at the world. I can never imagine dropping it, but it really, it's similar to like mechanics and engineering and the way that steam was like for Freud, for example, like the brain works because it builds up pressure here and it has to be released somewhere else. You know, that's the way we see the world, and I think one of the reasons games are ascendant is because we're surrounded by interactive systems. They govern our lives. And we also see the world through that framework. And games like illuminate that and intensify that framework. So that's one of the reasons that I think that they're so hot.
But quick games, so we can get.
I think interactivity is really the catchword in a way. But I'm always wondering, interacting with what?
Stuff.
Stuff. Yeah, but usually I would think it involves two actors interacting between two
Right,
actors.
so
And I think that I like this question. You know, if we consider ourselves as being this kind of free-floating semiotic entities, then I think the way we talk about interacting as well is, you know, illustrating a lot of things which could be also framed differently.
But can you say, is reality becoming more like a game? I do think that there's certain sort of, in a negative sense, that it seems everybody and the government loves the idea of benchmarking everything in schools and kids and subcontractors and so on. And that sort of, I think, is a game in the negative sense, where you set up a sort of fairly arbitrary measure of what's going on, and thereby you set up something that can sort of clearly be gamed, and you get something which wasn't necessarily what you set out to do. And I guess the other thing that was criticized was her name, Barbara Ehrenreich? Like she just wrote that book about, what's it called, about this kind of culture there, the US culture where you always get this kind of star no matter how badly you did. So there's kind of fake eluding imposter going on that things are presented as games, especially if you're a kid, but you always get a diploma, so which means that you actually don't actually get any kind of useful feedback.
Right.
So in that sense, in a kind of safe way.
Hi, I've been thinking a lot about the idea of challenge as all you're talking about this stuff, and I'm glad you mentioned education actually, because I think there's kind of a shared, there's something shared between art and games in a sense that we place a certain cultural value on on challenge and on education, on the types of challenges that are offered by both art and games. And I think, to me, there's more of an intellectual challenge maybe that's valued in contemporary art versus maybe a more mechanical or mental challenge offered by games. And but I feel like there's some way of kind of bridging art and games through talking about the idea of challenge and the cultural value placed on that. So I'm wondering if each of you could kind of talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because we think of like great 20th century art, we think of difficult art.
Right.
Beckett or Joyce. I mean, these are the classics of like, and then when we think of Fly Wrench, it's difficult in a different way. But there's resonance there, I think, yeah. I would say yes to that question. Okay. Those two ways of thinking about difficulty and challenge are maybe useful. They're certainly not identical.
It's a skill level, which is not necessarily an intellectual level. Right?
Well, they're both super intellectual. Like reading Joyce and playing Fly Wrench are two completely cognitive.
But it's a lot of motor skills, for instance, which you need to practice, and it's just that you don't. Okay, let's get it wrong. I'm trying to forget it. Okay.
Yeah.
I know we're short on time, so you can just give me one-word answers if you want. But as among other things, I am a fledgling curator, and I'm very intrigued by the idea of curating games. And what I've understood throughout the time I've spent here is that it's really hard to effectively curate games and to manage exhibition models that can be really generative that feature games. And so I'm wondering now, is this even worth pursuing?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, of course. If you're interested in it, it's worth doing. And then the struggle you go through trying to solve these problems will produce something useful and great.
Our closing keynote tomorrow will be talking about this very subject, I believe, and has written a book that doesn't necessarily speak just to games, but rather to the whole dealing with digital media in the white cube. So, all right, well, we probably should stop this now. So.